Hello Year 8 and welcome to Lesson 11 of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and today we're going to be turning our attention to beginning to plan for an assessment piece, and we're going to be looking very closely at the character of Edmund. But what I'd like you to do first of all is have a look at the image on the screen in front of you and ask yourself, what do you see? Okay, so just spend 5 seconds looking at that. And you might want to shout out or jot down what you see. And then when you're pretty confident about what you're seeing, have a look, because this is one of those pictures where if you look very carefully you can see two different images, and today's lesson is all to do with seeing two things in a character or exploring alternative interpretations of a character. So see if you can see another image now. Something very different. Okay, now some people, when they have a look at this image, the first thing they see is a skull. So I don't know if you can see the outline of the skull like that, and the eye sockets and the teeth and the jawbone there. Other people see a boat. So you've got the kind of shape of the boat there, the billowing sails. Everybody seems to be up in the crow's nest for some reason. So are you seeing the skull or are you seeing the ship at sea? Alternative interpretations. And that's what we're going to be doing with Edmund. So it might be helpful in this lesson if you can print off the other sheet that's attached to the lesson, the one that says Edmund, positive and negative extracts. If you can have that printed off, that will be useful, but not essential. You will be able to work without it. So let's start by looking at the objective then. Can I explore alternative interpretations of a character? And we've got a question here. Now, just looking ahead a little bit, this is the way one of the questions on the GCSE language paper is phrased, and it's inviting you to create an argument. So it's really good practice to start thinking about how you can look at two sides of an argument early on, so you're really confident when you come to GCSE. So here's the question. A student, having read this novel, said, "I found it very easy to dislike Edmund in the novel. He's the cause of so much suffering. To what extent do you agree?" And we're going to agree and disagree with the statement. We're going to look at two sides of the argument. So go to your worksheet then, task 1 on the worksheet. Before you start looking at the extracts, what can you remember about Edmund's actions and behaviour in the whole novel? Can you list as many reasons as you can to agree with that statement? It's easy to dislike him. He's caused suffering. But can you also think, well, hang on a minute. What about this? And what about that? And what about this? So you're beginning to create an alternative argument. So can you complete task 1? So let's have a closer look at Edmund then. Edmund is one of the characters that caused the most controversy in the novel. There's been a great deal of disagreement about what his character does and whether or not he is at core a horrible person. Did he want to betray his siblings? Was he weak and led astray by the White Witch and her magic? Or was he a victim being controlled by a higher power? There's lots of different interpretations we can think about Edmund. So let's have a look at the extracts now, and starting with the negative extracts. So you might want to have a pen in your hand. You might want to begin your annotation already as we read through the 5 little extracts from the whole novel. Start thinking about how we could make points to say, well, yes, Edmund is a dislikable character. He has caused lots of suffering. So, extract 1. The others, who thought she was telling a lie, and a silly lie too, made her very unhappy. The 2 elder ones did this without meaning to, but Edmund could be spiteful, and on this occasion he was spiteful. He sneered and jeered at Lucy and kept on asking her if she'd found any other new countries and any other cupboards all over the house. What made it worse was these days ought to have been delightful. And Edmund gave a very superior look, as if he was far older than Lucy, and there really was only a year's difference. and then a little snigger and said, "Oh yes, Lucy and I have been pretending that her story about a country in the wardrobe is true, just for fun, of course. There's nothing there really." Poor Lucy gave Edmund one look and rushed out of the room. Edmund, who was becoming a nastier person every minute, thought that he had scored a great success and went on to say, "Oh, there she goes again. What's the matter with her? That's the worst of young kids. They always—" "Look here," said Peter, turning on him savagely. "Shut up. You've been perfectly beastly to Lou ever since she started this nonsense about the wardrobe, and now you go playing games with her about it and setting her off again. I believe you did it simply out of spite." And then remember later on, Edmund sort of let slip that actually he had been to Narnia, and when he pretended not to know about it, it was a lie. "So you really were there," he said, and that's Peter speaking. "That time Lou said she'd met you in here, and you made out that she was telling lies?" There was a dead silence. "Well, of all the poisonous little beasts," said Peter, and shrugged his shoulders and said no more. There seemed indeed no more to say, and presently the four resumed their journey, but Edmund was saying to himself, "I'll pay you all for this, you pack of stuck-up, self-satisfied prigs." And then later on, when he begins to form this relationship with the Queen, we have this bit, and the Queen speaks first. "You are much the cleverest and handsomest young man I've ever met. I think I would like to make you the Prince some day. Will you bring the others to visit me?" "Well, why not now?" said Edmund. His face had become very red, and his mouth and fingers were sticky. He did not look clever or handsome, whatever the Queen might say. "Oh, but if I took you there now," she said, "I shouldn't see your brothers and sisters. I very much want to know your charming relations. You are to be the Prince and later on the King. That is understood. But you might have courtiers and nobles. I will make your brother a duke and your sister duchesses." "There's nothing special about them," said Edmund. "And anyway, I could always bring them some other time." Okay. Right, and then let's have a look at his behaviour when the idea of Aslan is introduced by the beavers. At the name of Aslan, each of the children felt something jump in its inside. Edmund felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Edmund noticed something else. Edmund could see two small hills, and he was almost sure they were the two hills which the White Witch had pointed out to him when he parted from her at the lamp-post the other day. And then between them, he thought, must be her palace, only a mile off or less. And he thought about Turkish delight and about being king. "And I wonder how Peter will like that," he asked himself. And horrible ideas came into his head. And those horrible ideas obviously lead to this, don't they? "The reason there's no use looking," said Mr. Beaver, "is that we already know where he's gone." Everyone stared in amazement. "Don't you understand?" said Mr. Beaver. "He's gone to her, the White Witch. He's betrayed us all." "Oh, surely, oh really," said Susan. "He can't have done that." "Can't he?" said Mr. Beaver, looking very hard at the three children, and everything they wanted to say died on their lips. For each felt suddenly quite certain inside that this was exactly what Edmund had done. And then finally, Edmund's gone off to find the White Witch, and he's in the palace, and he sees a statue who he thinks might be Aslan. Probably he thought this is the great lion, Aslan, that they were all talking about. She's caught him already and turned him into stone. So that's the end of their fine ideas about him. Phew, who's afraid of Aslan? And he stood there gloating over the stone lion, and presently he did something very silly and childish. He took a stump of lead pencil out of his pocket and scribbled a moustache on the lion's upper lip, and then a pair of spectacles on its eyes, and he said, "Yeah, silly old Aslan, how do you like being a stone? You thought yourself fine and mighty, didn't you?" Doesn't come off very well in those extracts, does he? So think about what we've just read and think about all the different reasons you could put in that negative column. You know, what is dislikable about his behaviour and how is he causing suffering in those extracts. So start filling in the negative column. Okay, right. Let's see if we can find some evidence to construct what we call a counter-argument so that we'll be able to say, well, hang on a minute, he's not entirely dislikable and he might cause suffering, but look at what he does later on. Or even we could find evidence to say, hang on a minute, none of this is his fault at all. You know, somebody else is entirely responsible for how Edmund is behaving. So let's go back to the beginning of the novel again. We are told right at the very start, once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to a house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. So is there anything in that might help you explain, you know, why Edmund is behaving the way he is? Then think about when he meets the witch for the first time. Think about her appearance and also think about what she does to him. And can we hold him accountable for anything that he does from this moment onwards? But behind him, on a much higher seat in the middle of the sledge, sat a very different person. The person in front is the little dwarf driving the sledge, not Edmund. A great lady, taller than any woman that Edmund had ever seen. She also was covered in white fur up to her throat and held a long, straight golden wand in her right hand and wore a golden crown on her head. Her face was white, not merely pale, but white like snow or paper or icing sugar, except for her very red mouth. It was a beautiful face in other respects, but proud and cold and stern. "My poor child," she said in quite a different voice, "how cold you look. Come and sit with me here on the sledge and I will put my mantle around you and we will talk." Edmund did not like this arrangement at all, but he dared not disobey. At last, the Turkish Delight, remember she's given him this box of Turkish Delight, was all finished and Edmund was looking very hard at the empty box and wishing that she would ask him whether he would like some more. Probably the Queen knew quite well what he was thinking, for she knew, though Edmund did not, that this was enchanted Turkish Delight, and that anyone who had once tasted it would want more and more of it, and even if they were allowed to go on eating it until they killed themselves. Okay, so we've got some big arguments to defend Edmund there, haven't we? Enchanted Turkish Delight from a magical white witch who carries a wand. Right, and then we've got, and oh, how miserable he was. It didn't look now as if the witch intended to make him king. He would have given anything to meet the others at this moment, even Peter. The only way to comfort himself now was to try and believe the whole thing was a dream and that he might wake up any moment. And as they went on, hour after hour, it did come to seem like a dream. So this is when Edmund's gone back to the witch and they're kind of hunting for the other children, aren't they? Remember they come across that party of animals that have been given a picnic by Santa. Then she raised her wand. "Oh, don't, please don't," shouted Edmund. But even while he was shouting, she waved her wand, and instantly, where the merry party had been, there were only statues of creatures. "As for you," said the witch, giving Edmund a stunning blow on the face as she remounted the sledge, "let that teach you to ask favours for spies and traitors. Drive on." And Edmund, for the first time in this story, felt sorry for someone besides himself. It seemed so pitiful to think of those little stone figures sitting there all the silent days and the dark nights, years after year, till the moss grew on them, and at last their faces crumble away. Okay, right, and then Edmund finds himself in a very perilous situation when the witch tries to kill him. Edmund found himself being roughly forced to his feet. Then the dwarf set him with his back against a tree and bound him fast. He saw the witch take off her outer mantle. Her arms were bare underneath it and terribly white. Because they were so very white he could see them, but he could not see much else. It was so dark in this valley under the trees. "Prepare the victim," said the witch. And the dwarf undid Edmund's collar and folded back his shirt at the neck. Then he took Edmund's hair and pulled his head back so that he had to raise his chin. After that, Edmund heard a strange noise. Whiz, whiz, whiz. For a moment he couldn't think what it was, and then he realised it was the sound of a knife being sharpened. Whoa, so about to slit his throat. And then we have, he's gone back, he's re-met his brothers and sisters. There's been that huge battle, remember, and they've managed to win the battle. But here's a description of Edmund's role in the battle. "It was all Edmund's doing, Aslan," Peter was saying. "We'd have been beaten if it hadn't have been for him. The witch was turning our troops into stone right and left, but nothing would stop him. He fought his way through 3 ogres to where she was just turning one of your leopards into a statue. And when he reached her, he had the sense to bring his sword smashing down on her wand instead of trying to go for her directly and simply being made into a statue himself for his pains. That was the mistake all the rest of us were making. Once her wand was broken, we began to have some chance, if we hadn't lost so many already. He was terribly wounded. We must go and see him." They found Edmund in the charge of Mrs. Beaver a little way back from the fighting line. He was covered with blood. His mouth was open and his face a nasty green colour. So we can definitely use that in our defence of Edmund, can't we? Look at the lengths he goes to in order to put his mistakes right. And then this is an interesting bit. This is from Susan's perspective when she sees him, he's been made better again. "When at last she was free to come back to Edmund, she found him standing on his feet, and not only healed of his wounds, but looking better than she'd seen him look for ages. In fact, since the first term at that horrid school, which was where he had begun to go wrong. He had become his real old self again and could look you in the face. And there on the battlefield, Aslan made him a knight." Now, there's only that really brief description there. We're told about a horrid old school where he began to go wrong. At the end of the lesson, I've added a challenge task that some of you might want to have a look at to investigate what boarding schools, the type of boarding school that Edmund went to, what they might have been like in the 1940s and why that might make a child go wrong. Right, now you've gathered all your ideas together, you're going to finalise your planning for a longer piece of work that you'll start doing next lesson. And I want you to start thinking about the very best ideas that you've got from all of those different extracts that we've read. So start off with the negative column, and we're looking at task 2 on your worksheet. So we've read the extracts, we've thought about why the extracts might present Edmund as a negative character, and now we're going to plan for some P or Peter paragraphs. So we want to make our points, we want to select short quotes as evidence, and we want to begin to explain why we've chosen that evidence. What's the significance of keywords and phrases? Are there any interesting language devices being used there? And you can see that I've done the first one for you. You'll have to forgive me because I'm looking at the different screen here. Edmund is very unkind to his sister Lucy. So that's a really obvious one from the first extract that we had. And I've pulled out some short key quotes. He's described as being spiteful, and we're told that he sneered and jeered at her. Okay, so I've written my point in full, but the rest of it's in note form. Okay, it's tiny boxes. We're planning. We're not going to be writing out in full sentences here. And if you look at the final column, again in note form, not in full sentences. And look how I've used the equal sign to show, this is my explanation. This is what I think about this word. I've put spiteful equals, that word means wanting to hurt somebody. And I've also noted the fact that it's been repeated twice. And repetition is really important to emphasize certain points, isn't it? And we've also got sneered and jeered there. And there's a kind of rhyme going on there, isn't it? Really kind of sing-songy and a bit like nah, 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 nah. So it really emphasises the fact that he's laughing at her, he's mocking her. Don't forget that at this point, well, I'm going to get my chronology wrong. I was going to say at this point he has been to Narnia, but I don't think he has at this point. But, being really deliberately unkind. So I've given you 3 more boxes, so choose wisely. Can you pick out 3 more things that would support the statement that he's dislikable and that he causes lots of suffering? So 3 clear points. You're writing the points in full, but everything else is in note form. Choose nice short quotes, pinpoint the key words, don't copy big long quotes out, snatch and grab the important bits, and then begin to start planning your explanations in note form. Once you've done that, then go to the positive sheet again. Task 2 is continued on the other page on your worksheet, and you're going to try and do exactly the same, come up with 3 positive points about Edmund. And again, I've done the first one for you. I've said, hang on a minute, hang on, Edmund's only a child. Can we really, say that he's dislikable and causes suffering? And also he's in a really, really stressful situation, isn't he? He's been sent away from London because of the air raids, and he's living in a house that's 10 miles from the nearest railway station. And it's very clear that he's a child. So again, in my explanation part, I've emphasised the fact that he's very young. We know he's the second youngest. Lucy is the very youngest. So he's not that old at all, is he? Air raids, he's lived through a period of incredible stress and fear and worry, literally bombs coming out of the sky. We don't know where his parents are. Has he left his parents back in London? Is he worried sick about their safety? And also the fact that he's been just dumped in the middle of the countryside with a completely, in a completely unfamiliar house with strangers. He's in the heart of the countryside. So that metaphor helps to really emphasize how isolated the house is, how rural. Edmund's a city boy, and he's been, shoved into this kind of rural, isolated house. He's going to be frightened, isn't he? And when people are frightened, they don't always behave as they normally would. So you can see my thinking there, the way I'm beginning to construct a counter-argument. So can you find 3 other points from the positive sheet to say, oh, hang on a minute, it's all very well to say that he's dislikable and causes suffering, but what about this? You're creating a counter-argument. Okay, is we're going to put our argument together, and we are going to write the introduction of what's going to be a larger piece of assessment work. Okay, so imagine I was writing about a different character. I've chosen Scrooge from A Christmas Carol. Now, lots of you might be familiar with that story, but don't worry if you aren't familiar with the story, because it's the style of writing here. So if I was writing an essay about Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, I'm going to create an introduction that outlines my argument. It could be argued that Scrooge is one of the most unpleasant characters in literature. He's unfriendly and antisocial, miserly and selfish, as well as being completely lacking in Christmas spirit. However, we can also look upon Scrooge with sympathy. The novel reveals the way he was treated as a child and helps explain his behaviour. He's living through the 19th century, and many of the ideas and his opinions were popular at the time. Most importantly, he's inspiring because he learns how to change. Now, you might have noticed that I'm doing something with my fingers there. So I want you to think about how that introduction has been structured. Why was I kind of counting on my fingers there? How many points have I made on either side of the argument? Which side of the argument do you think I most agree with? How do you think the rest of my essay is going to be structured? And how would you begin to write a similar introduction to our Edmund question? So have a think about that for a minute. You can pause the video if you want and jot some ideas down. But what you should have noticed is the side of the argument I most agree with, I've put second, because it's a counter argument. When you're doing a counter argument, you put the other side of the argument first, and then you turn to your argument. Some people, it could be argued, other people might say this, and you give your reasons, and then you come back to your argument and you say, however, what's actually right is this. So have a look at that again. It could be argued that Scrooge is blah, blah, blah. However, we can also look upon Scrooge with sympathy. So it's clear that I am more sympathetic. I've saved those points till last. What I've done then is I've very quickly, without giving any explanation, any detail at all, I've simply listed the reasons, haven't I? Yes, it could be argued that Scrooge is an unpleasant character. He's unfriendly and antisocial. He's miserly and selfish, completely lacking in Christmas spirit. Okay, so I've given 3 reasons on one side. However, we can also look upon him with sympathy. 3 reasons. Okay, so how is the rest of my essay going to be structured? Well, there are going to be 6 paragraphs now, aren't there? There are going to be 6 paragraphs that first of all follow the 3 negatives and then move and have a look at the 3 positives. And maybe there'll be a 7th paragraph where I just wrap things up as a conclusion. So that's the style of writing that you're going to have a go at. Using the planning that you've done in Task 2 and using the sentence starters that I've given you on the next slide and on the worksheet, you're going to have a go at just writing your introduction. It should be really short. I don't think that's much more than 80, 100 words. So you're not going into any detail at all. You're laying your argument out. Okay, so decide which side of the argument you're on. Do you actually think he's really dislikable and causes suffering, or do you think actually there are reasons why he does that, and he, if you weigh it all up, he's a much more admirable character? So remember, your opinion is going to go second. Okay, so you're going to say, well, it could be argued that Edmund is blah de blah de blah. In the novel, he hubba-dubba-da, hubba-dubba-da, and dubba-dubba-da. However, we could also argue that he's dubba-dubba-dubba-da. This is because dubba-dubba-da, dubba-dubba-da, dubba-dubba-da. So it's up to you where you put the phrases, is a character who's easy to dislike, or we should view Edmund with more sympathy. And as you're writing your introduction, go back and have a look at that one I've done on Scrooge as well, and make sure that yours is very similar to that. Right, just as a bit of fun then to end the lesson, let's see if we can make an Edmund acrostic that brings all our different ideas about Edmund together. So we write Edmund down the left-hand side and then use each of those initial letters to start a sentence. So I've got Edmund defeated the witch at the end. Can you create something for D-M-U-N-D? And remember, there's a challenge task as well. Right, so welcome to the challenge task. Now, this is the bit of working with a novel that I enjoy the most, and maybe it's because at university I studied English alongside history, so I'm always really interested in how a work of fiction, a story, connects actually to the real world and the time that it's written in. When you get to GCSE, this becomes a very, very important assessment objective. It's called AO3, and it's looking at the relationship between the text and the context. So the events that were happening in the world, any, important people that influenced the text, any important historical events. Okay, so if you don't know much about what boarding schools were like in the 1940s, then you can use the following texts in order to explore some of those ideas. So if you remember, we were told, Susan says, he was looking better than she'd seen him look, for ages. In fact, since the first term at that horrid school where he began to go wrong, he'd become his real old self again. Now, that's just mentioned very quickly, and it does seem to suggest that something happened at this school, didn't it? And remember, I think he's 9, sent away to boarding schools. What on earth were boarding schools like back then, and how might that have an impact on his behaviour? Now, we're going to have a look at Roald Dahl to help us with this, and we're going to think about boys' boarding schools, okay? So it's highly likely that the school that Edmund would have gone to in the novel would have been a boys' public boarding school. Now, don't be confused by the word public. It actually refers to private, fee-paying, independent secondary schools, some of whom can be very exclusive and incredibly expensive. So if you're, rather well off and incredibly wealthy, you might go to a school like Harrow, where the fees are £13,000 a term. Okay, not for the year. I mean, even for a year, that's a jaw-droppingly a huge amount of money. That's a term. There are 3 terms in the school year. You do the maths. The average yearly wage in the UK is something around 26,000 last time I looked. So, ouch. So, in the early 20th century, these schools weren't always particularly nice places. C.S. Lewis and Roald Dahl were born 20 years apart, but they both attended these kind of private boarding schools, and they would have been, boys only or girls only. What I've got for you then is I've got an extract from a biography of Roald Dahl, which reveals some of the conditions in the school. But of course, if you've ever read Roald Dahl's autobiography, him writing about himself and his life, then you'll know that he wrote quite a lot about his experiences of boarding school. So you've got an extract from his autobiography, Boy, there. If we can, possibly build an argument to say, well, this is what boarding schools were like. These are some of the things that Edmund might have experienced. Even his sister says he was very different when he came back after the first term. We might be able to, begin to frame an argument and explain why Edmund is horrible to his sisters and, does the things he does. So enjoy the challenge task if you're up for it, and you can jot your ideas down, write your ideas up in that final box on your worksheet then.